Hey Team Sunderland Sounds, welcome to episode number 4 of Coffee with Creatives. Before we jump right in, I just wanted to say thanks for all your support. The channel's growing at a very nice pace, and I owe it all to you, so thank you. I got to do the mandatory, please subscribe to my channel, please hit the bell. We've got the buy me a coffee thing. If you don't mind pitching in a couple of bucks, it always helps to offset all the work that we do. So thank you for that. I'm not going to take a ton of time here with this intro, but what I am going to do is I'm going to share this bio right here of Kim Pesataro, also known as Annie James Thomas, who is our guest here on episode number 4. A fantastic writer, a longtime friend, and she's just written really a masterpiece called The Boy Who Brought the Sea. And if you haven't read it, that's okay. You can watch the interview and it won't be spoiled for you. So sit back, enjoy, take a few minutes, think about it, and then get out there and buy her book. Without further ado, here's the episode. Thanks again. Welcome to Coffee with Creatives number 4. Here with my special guest, Kim Pesataro, author of The Boy Who Brought the Sea, a fantastic book that I just finished reading. So thank you for joining, Kim. Kim also is co-owner, I believe, of the online literary press, Loud Coffee Press, which is a literary press for lovers of both microfiction and short stories. So welcome, Kim. Do you want to do maybe a quick introduction and tell people about
Thanks,
where you're coming from? Yeah,
sure. I would love to. So actually, you have an advanced reader copy of the book, and this is the updated version of the cover. So
I love the,
thank you.
The maroonish color. Yeah.
Yep, which ties into the book. But so we co-founded. I'm a co-founder of Loud Coffee Press. It's been in business for about 6 years now, and it's definitely my passion project. It's I hate to say my side job, but it's not the one that pays the bills. And we get
that.
We have submissions from all over the world. We have we're kind of big in Scotland, which I think is pretty funny. But we take submissions of flash fiction, poetry, and art, and they're all centered loosely around themes of coffee and music. Because when we think about creatives, we think about what are 2 things that drive people's creativity, and it's coffee and music in a lot of situations. And so we put out a quarterly, we're moving into a triannually magazine issue now, but that's in its 5th year. So
that's amazing. Yeah, I feel like there's some synergy, coffee and music, and writing, and fantastic. And I have read several of the publications, so I would certainly recommend it. Want to talk about the book a little bit. The Boy Who Brought the Sea, definitely, I hate making comparisons to other books because it is its own entity, but the immediate descriptions and things that come to mind are like Moby Dick, Fever Dream, sort of dystopian reality, Gothic horror, Victorian, that sort of vibe. And in the protagonist, whose name is Fiona, I'm a very visual person. And so my first visual when I thought of your protagonist was like this sepia toned, like a Daguerreau type shot, even like maybe with like the old blast shot, as she made her way through a world that was really in the periphery of social norms. But it was also one that felt like she was being set up for a measure of success in the book. And I could relate to it as this sort of stereotypical ADHD kid whose parents weren't in line with the society that I was coming up in, and certainly the town I grew up in. But I knew that there was a possibility through alternative thinking and living and just this sort of like secondary approach to the world. What inspired you to build Fiona's world in that time period and in that in the headspace that you were in?
So I want to just mention something back when you first, in the beginning of this question, you talked about it sort of being the sepia toned image that comes to mind. And I think that's so funny because when I wrote the book, originally I had started querying agents for the book. I ultimately ended up self-publishing through the independent publishing process. But I had described the book as structurally akin to The Wizard of Oz. And because I thought of that so I think of this book as almost like a 3-act structure, with the second 2 acts kind of, going back and forth between different narrators. But I see it as you get introduced to Fiona's life. It is very sepia toned, right? It is that first part of the Wizard of Oz. And then you move into the second part of the book. She goes on this journey, which we'll probably talk somewhat about. And that's when we move her into color. And then we come back into reality, which is sepia toned again. And so that's really interesting to me that you picked up on that, because that was a very visual thing I had as I was writing the book.
Yeah, it
As far
absolutely
as,
translated. Yeah.
so thank you. I'm so glad that came across. As far as the inspiration, a couple of things. I laugh because I think I tend to write in a very stilted dialogue style. And I was like, well, how can I take advantage of that? Because my dialogue doesn't come out naturally. That's the hardest thing for me to write. I was like, well, if I make it a more formal style, it seems to fit my writing better. So that was one of the reasons this book is somewhat centered. I don't define a time frame for the book, but in my mind, it is very Victorian up until mid-century. It's somewhere in that general time frame. And then the book itself came from, I was actually years ago driving to work one day. This was before I even had podcasts, tuned into my car. And I think I was listening to, it was WGBH, the PBS radio shows that used to be on. I used to listen to like the Moth Story Hour, things like that. I don't remember the story, but what stood out to me was somebody talking about how they had twins and one was left-handed and one was right-handed. And it just came to me that I would write a book about twins that had these total polar opposite characteristics, and that formed the foundation of this book. So kind of all those things rolled up together, and I started writing it in, let me think. It was not what it is now. It was a ghost story when I started writing it, and everything was very fantastical. And so now what it is I think a very true story. I eliminated the supernatural elements, but it transitioned over time. And I didn't even see this story when I started. It was more like, what can I just put down in scenes, and then I'd find my through line.
Amazing. And I think it feels like, at least, in your description, it's like the story was writing through you over a long period of time.
Yeah.
To me, that's the best art. It's, coming from a music perspective, when you start writing a song with a group of people, it's like you have this idea, but there's usually like it's like hitting a stride, like I would imagine for a runner, where there's a point where you start to hit this like collective unconsciousness, I guess, where the music starts playing itself and you all start flying in that same flying pattern. And it felt like, based on what you were saying, that it started as this ghost story, but it sort of took on its own life as you played with like tone and approach. So that's really cool to hear, and it's very consistent with artistic experiences that I've been lucky enough to go through. Very cool.
I think that's the whole thing about flow state, right? Like you get into your flow, and then once you're there, you sort of ride that wave throughout. And it can be so hard to get there, but it's so magical when you do.
I love that term, flow state. I say that all the time, and people are like, what do you mean by flow state? It's like, well, when we talk about like doing videos, or talk about any work that you want to do that's creative, and everybody's like, a writer's block. It's like, okay, if you have a writer's block, just write.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter if it's good or bad, just write. Because eventually something is going to happen on its own. If you're inspired, I guess, at any point in time, eventually some of that's going to just kind of go through you, as opposed to it all being like cerebral and like upfront in your consciousness. And that's the most rewarding part of the experience for me, certainly. Talking about the left hand and the right hand experience, I love it. Don't want to give away too much of the book, but to your point, Fiona and her sister, who was the sickly twin, those two sisters set a darker vibe, a narrative of an unfortunate relationship of turmoil that extended to the full family. And I feel like we all sort of collectively have some of that somewhere in our extended families. Can you tell me about how the idea of darkness in a family lineage sort of presented itself for you?
Yeah. And I think, I joke about the fact that I actually have two sisters, and, we can always say things about our family, and I love my sisters very much, but we can butt heads and be at odds just like anybody else. And when I started writing this book, I laughed about the fact that I'm like, oh, did this come from somewhere unintended? Did this come from somewhere, something very personal or deeply held? And it really didn't. I think it more was that it started from what in my mind was a creepy story, or a darker story. But I wanted to create a story where the characters were ultimately true to themselves, but you could have some sympathy for them and understand that, they are products of their circumstances. And I think in this story, the main character, Fiona, is very much a product of her circumstance. She's highly intelligent. She's been around nothing but books all her life. And I'll mention, for those that haven't read the book, her and her twin sister are raised trapped in their own house. So they've never left the house. Everything comes to them. They have a nanny, they have a teacher, they have a mother who has some interesting dynamics with them. So what the main character has developed is this highly intellectual set of skills, but really no social skills, and so she's at odds with her sister because she's trapped in the house. Her sister's too sick to leave, but what's her reason for staying? And that's a lot of what unravels in the book.
Yeah, certainly. So the protagonist, Fiona, her interaction with the sea community at large, and the idea of Damon and sort of the personal relationship with, a boy while she's locked inside of this house, created that fever dream vibe that I got from Moby Dick, but also got from writers like Robert Kloss, who you may or may not know, a friend of mine from years ago, wrote a book called Alligators of Abraham. A lot of that same sort of starts linear and ends up non-linear. What was your approach to the character arc? And, just knowing that that's how it delivered for me, was that your intention? And what was your approach to building that either relation? I'm not sure how to even say, but the relationship or non-relationship with the boy character.
Well, so I think it's so interesting that you picked up on the Moby Dick and the fever dream aspect of this, because that was totally my intent. Moby Dick is one of my favorite books of all time, and it very much reads like a fever dream to me. I mean, that is how I interpret it, to the point where it's affected me so much I've got a tattoo of it down my arms.
Awesome.
And then one of the other books, if you were to ask me, like, where would this fall on a shelf? I'm not sure if you're familiar with the book Fever Dream by Samantha Schweblin.
I'm not. But I will.
So that book, to me, it's exactly as the title says. It's a fever dream, but it's so intense and episodic, very similar to I think what the style of this book is. But I think for me, the beginning of it is that sort of slow build, right? And because of a couple of things. I think one, I started writing it in just these scenes, not knowing where the story was going, which is not my typical approach. Usually I have a very definitive ending. But then I realized that something bad had to happen to this character, like something that had to come into this character that put her really at odds with everything around her. And for that, I needed her to be of age. I needed her to be older because of the adult themes that kind of carry through the book. And so there's a reason, I don't want to give away the ending, but when you look back on the opening chapters, you can kind of see that the book is a little bit more of a conversation than you may have expected, right? So it's somewhat episodic in times of her life growing up. And you need to know about her development. You need to know about that character arc to know why she sort of lands where she does. And so a lot of that, we kind of call back to it in the third act. And you see that things may not have been. She's an unreliable narrator. We'll just say that.
Yeah.
But as far as, the external relationship, she meets this friend named Damon, and he sort of changes the course of her story, right? He says, you're trapped in your house. You need to leave. And how does she do that? He presents the mechanism for her to do that. And again, there's some twisty parts to that, how she met Damon. I won't get too far into, but she was forbidden from making friends outside the house. And I think that's one of the biggest points about her meeting Damon, is how that comes to be.
Yeah. And it creates such a unique conundrum because she's not supposed to have the relationship, but she's, this budding teenager becoming a woman, that whole experience is happening, but also she has to stay inside of her house. So you can imagine the level of, I don't know, for me, it was anxiety, the level of anxiety that's happening, the tension that's building at that point. And I also, there's so many other things I want to say because I have read the book. But it was just such a great moment of tension for me. So that was really cool.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
The switching topics a little bit, the roles of the mother figure and the nanny were, I thought, really, really interesting. Felt a bit like a social commentary. And traditionally, it felt like the roles were switched, right?
Yes.
Where the nanny was more the mother, and the mother was more sort of like peripheral. Um, I feel like this is even sort of a common current theme, just based on our working hours, based on social norms in capitalism, that kind of thing. Was there a prompt in your process? And I keep talking about your process because that's what I'm most interested in. So feel free to redirect here a little bit. But
No, it was a process.
was there a prompt in the writing process for that relationship? And like as I think about that relationship for the further, like the absence of the father, which I know the story of the father, I don't want to give that away, but more want to get to the root of like how did those relationships come about as you were writing the story?
Yeah, so funny. So I think if, we want to talk about, did this come from anywhere real? Unintentionally, no, but I'm very close with my dad. I'm very close with my mom too, but I think we grew up sort of butting heads more than my dad and I did, so I definitely had that loose situation set up for me as, when I was growing up. But with the mother, you see things throughout the book that kind of hint towards this, although we don't really get into it. But you see, like, she's got a glass of wine that's kind of dried out on her sofa, or she's got some tarot cards, and you're like, well, where does this all play in? And I think what I was trying to show is the mother has had these two children raised in the house her whole life. They're now, well into their teen years. They both obviously have got significant difficulties. I wanted to show a mother who was burnt out. And so to me, she's brought in all this extra help. And it's one thing when you can leave the home, you're sort of the hired person, right? And you can go and rejuvenate and recharge. The mother doesn't have that option. She's at this point, we know her to be a single mother of two grown children. And so the mother, the nanny, and then there's also a teacher that comes in. In my mind, they had very different personalities. The nanny was much more, I'm going to raise you day to day. We're going to make your bed, have you do your hair. You're going to do your chores. And then the teacher has a little bit more of that actual maternal, nurturing, loving side to her that really just comes out in just small doses, but enough to be really affecting to the main character.
Motherly. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And being an unreliable narrator, the main character presents this image of the mother, but I think some of what you get later in the story is that image may not have been entirely true. It was a mother doing the best she could with what she had at the time, and it comes across in a way that is, where the main character doesn't see it as that. She sees it maybe more hurtful.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, I don't know if irony is the right word, but I'd like to think that that's going to resonate for readers when you do actually take a non-biased, clear look at what the modern American family looks like.
Yeah.
We start to see similarities there.
Right.
And so as the story develops and you start to maybe examine that a little bit, you start going, oh, wait a minute. This hits a little bit closer to home than I would have expected.
Yeah.
So that was really cool. So the dream world and the reality world overlap throughout the book, like we were just discussing. And one of my favorite parts was not trying to figure out what was what, and instead of trying to figure it out, feeling my way through the story. And this was my favorite part about the experience. And so in that headspace, my question to you, and this is like totally high level, there's no answer, is does horror, suspense, psychological suspense, does it need to be visceral to have the same type of affect in your experience?
Oh, totally. 100%. I think for me, I define horror very loosely, and I would say this is not a scary book to me, right? So some people are saying, "Oh, I don't read horror." This is not horror in that sense whatsoever. I think to me, it's like more on the psychological level, right? And I think that's what makes it so visceral, or horror so visceral, is when you really don't know what's happening. I have read books that don't have that. And I'll give you an example here because it's a wildly famous book, but the Amityville Horror book.
Mhm.
It reads like a documentary. And there is almost no visceral reaction in that book from the characters, what's going on. It's just very much, this happened, then this happened, so we did this, and so on. But I need to put myself in a book. I need to be moved by a book. It doesn't need to be gory. In fact, most of what I consider to be the best horror is not gory at all, right? It's completely psychological. And so, yeah, I have to be moved by it, or else I won't classify it that way. It's very interesting.
Yeah.
Raise a feeling of not just fear, but maybe some dread or some anxiety. It's got to raise that sense in you, right? You got to get your hackles up.
And that's what I love. I mean, you and I have talked a million times about like the A24 movies and all that kind of stuff. That's the stuff. I get so excited because they do that so well, and it is so visceral. I can't, like, there's a moment in time in every one of those movies, or at least, again, the psychological. I use horror loosely, but things that have sort of an anxiety effect. I'm inside of it. Like when I'm feeling that way, I'm inside of the movie. And there's nothing else existing in your periphery when those moments are happening. So I agree 100%. Are there other genres of writing that you would like to explore in the future or are planning to explore? Or is, psychological thrillers, suspense, horror more the wheelhouse that you're planning to work in the future?
I never thought this was going to be my wheelhouse. In fact, I didn't even start watching horror movies. I'm an A24 junkie, you know this. I didn't even start watching horror till about 10 years ago. I didn't think I had the capacity for it, the stomach for it. But I think, if not horror, much more of the psychological aspect is sort of where I feel best writing. I have tried to write things that have fallen a little more towards the romantic side of things. I didn't like the feel of it. I've tried to write more modern, contemporary things. I didn't like the feel of it. To me, this is my sweet spot. And so I've actually got three other books in the works right now, but one is a total secret project. And one of them is an 80s Gothic horror that's set in a salon, in a basement salon in a house, like in a tenement house. And so that was like,
yeah, I can already feel that. Yes.
And then I've got another one that's a bit more of a modern, it's not a modern book, but it's a bit more of a modern retelling of the Yellow Wallpaper. Yellow Wallpaper was a book published by Charlotte Perkins Gilman in the late 1800s. And it's a really short story that talks about a woman who is in the throes of postpartum depression. Her husband, who I believe is a physician, puts her upstairs in an attic room of their house, and she starts to see images come through in the wallpaper. And it's a sign of her, her psychosis after the depression, but it just talks about unraveling. And so I think that, to me, is just a really prominent theme. It's something that I really like writing in that style, that feels, I don't want to write all books that sound the same. They're not all going to be like trapped in a house kind of books, but for right now, that's my sweet spot.
I love it. If I'm ever writing music or recording or in an album or excuse me, in a studio working on a record or something like that, there are two things that I do. I avoid certain music, and then I also will bring certain songs or albums with me as a means of trying to influence whatever I'm doing subconsciously. Mm-hmm. Are there any movies or books that you avoid watching or reading when you're writing?
Oh, good question. Not that I actively avoid. I would say no. And I'll tell you why. Oftentimes I'll read something that really resonates with me, or, here's something, I'll have a playlist going and, this is the atmosphere I want to build. If I try to go outside of what I think I've honed to be sort of my voice and the way I write, it doesn't work for me. And so oftentimes I'll read an author or I'll watch a movie or something, and I'll say, I love the style, right? I really, I don't want to copy a style by any means, but sometimes you want to be influenced by it because you just think it's so good, right? Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. And I can't. So ultimately, even if I try, I'm like, oh, this doesn't sound like me. And I go back to me anyway. So I find that it really doesn't matter.
That's awesome.
But I think it's a great question because I know so many people that it does, and they will specifically avoid that type of thing.
I think there's something really cool to be said about the fact that you're close enough to your vision to be able to say, like, hey, it's cool, I can make this playlist, it's in that headspace, but also like it doesn't really bother me that much because I know when I'm done reading what I wrote, if it works or if it doesn't work, right?
Totally.
Which is unique. That's really cool.
It's taken me a long time to get to that point. I've been writing my entire life, and now I'm in my early 40s, and I feel like I'm finally starting to get there.
That's awesome. What are your plans for bringing the book to the masses? Is that even important? And how would you define the demographic? I mean, we know psychological thriller, but like, how would you define the demographic of the folks who you think might read this book?
So I have always heard as a writer that you write the book that you want to read. And I never believed it because I was like, well, why am I writing a book for me when you want to get into the hands of readers? And now I get it because you're going to have to read it 700 times in the editing process, the revision process. So I consider myself to be the target demographic. So what is that? And I think it's somebody who just loves, you like to sort of be messed with by a book. You like things that are unintended, not unintended. You like things that are unexpected in a book. You know, you like to think about it. You like, something when you finish, you close the last chapter, it stays with you for a little bit. And so I would say if you love, the psychological aspects of things, literary fiction, it's not an easy read, and I know that, but I also, if you are a fan of certain authors, I think you'll like this. So for me, one of the big influences was Ian Reid, who wrote I'm Thinking of Ending Things. That was a great book and a great movie as well, which I believe was an A24. He also put out a book recently called We Spread that I think is very much in a similar style to this. I mentioned Samantha Schweblin earlier on. She wrote Fever Dream, and that was fabulous. Julia Armfield wrote Our Wives Under the Sea. Again, it's one of those books where very much feels like a fever dream. And I would also say if you like the book Piranesi, I'm not quite sure how to say it, but that's one of my favorites. And so if you're somewhere on that literary shelf, I think you'll like this book.
Awesome. And
I have no idea how to get it to the masses.
Hey,
Tell me.
you know what? I don't want to go down the marketing wormhole, but I remember the year that Napster first came out, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the comments that one of my industry friends said to me is that because of Napster, the industry started falling apart. And he said that, when the industry fails, the music flourishes. So I think there is not only an inverse relationship between commerce and art, but I also think that this dials into sort of a bigger, and this is hyperbolic maybe, but like a cultural renaissance that's happening. Going back to even the previous question, when you say, I'm writing for me, right? 99% of popular music that you and I listen to in our, teens or whatever, yes, there were those movements that, the grunge movement in Seattle or whatever those different movements were, but popular music has always been formulaic. Mm-hmm. And I imagine that there's elements of that too in writing. And when I listen to you say, hey, my target demographic is me, that makes complete sense. When you look at where art is going, where music is going, and how it's being consumed. Yeah, there's Spotify and all that stuff, but nobody is buying an album from a record label, right? Nobody is, at least I'm not going to Penguin or whatever and saying, oh, who's on the Penguin roster, right?
Right.
We just don't do that anymore. And so I feel like we're in the middle of a giant transition, and it's nice to be in the front of it. And I love hearing you say, I don't know. And I almost want to hear you say that I don't care, because that's where I feel like everybody is going.
That's my next point. I guess I don't really care because I am such a massive supporter of the independent arts. That's what Loud Coffee Press is. We don't charge for submissions. We don't charge you to read the magazine. It truly is a labor of work and love. But to me, this is not the job that's going to pay the bills. That'd be great, right? But that's not why we do it. I do it to be able to say, okay, I'm holding my book in my hand, and that is the coolest feeling in the world. But I've spent so much time in the indie space, and to the point where I even have a TEDx talk out about squashing imposter syndrome, because it's, awesome. You are qualified to pursue your creative passion, no matter what the ultimate outlet is, right? And I think those are the kind of people I want to attract, right? So if there is a target demographic, I would say that's what it is.
In the ever-changing social media world, it's both cool and uncool, just because I don't like to sit and scroll on my phone all day long. But it's cool to see apps like Substack popping up that I hadn't heard of until like 2 weeks ago, where you can actually get closer to a writer's thoughts and feelings. And, I can't help but contrast that to like the 80s, like the hair metal of the 80s, where it was almost like you were in the audience, and then there's this giant wall, and then there's the band way up there on the stage, and now it's communal. but it's communal on this like large scale, right? Like Ted, I'm going to pronounce his name wrong. Ted Gioia. It's one of the guys. Okay, so you're familiar with him. I read his newsletter, and then Heather Cox Richardson is another one that I'm really into. And it's like, they take questions and you can reach out and, for a little bit of money, then you can go to the next level. And, it's like the same with the Patreon accounts. Like it's drawing people together quietly, but it's drawing people together. How much do you plan to interact in that world, or do you?
So I have done a lot of work in that space from the Loud Coffee Press perspective. And if you were to ask me at its heart what Loud Coffee Press is, yes, it's a literary magazine. Yes, it's a small press, but it's a community for writers. And that's what we've always meant it to be. We have hundreds of blog posts up where we've done interviews with other folks. And we really try to we don't judge a work based on what's come previous to it. It's what does the merit of the work bring at that moment. So I've spent a lot of time there with Instagram, with Twitter, with moving into other spaces. I find to be a little overwhelming. And what I think is interesting is I don't want to lose sight of the fact that just because I'm in the writer community in these spaces, not everybody is. And so to me, we can talk about process, but I talk about process all day. And I'm like, well, who really wants to hear about the writer's process? And then I realize, I put a book out and people are like, you wrote a book. And to me, this is very normal for the community I'm in. It may not be as normal external to that community, so it is interesting because if I see it for a musician, which I would love to be a musician, I'm not a musician, I'm going to read all about process. I'm going to read all about like, how did you come to this, so I have to keep that in mind. So my plans are probably to go a little bit more into that space. I'd love to see what I can do with it. I think it's a great place to blog, a great place to put some of this stuff that's never going to make it to the, more mainstream publishing. Yeah. You can serialize books that way. I've seen authors do that. I think that's a fabulous way to go, chapter by chapter, week by week.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's all new to me. Like just the idea of, communal, right? It's communal.
It is. It is.
It's brilliant stuff. It's new to me, and certainly something that I want to explore and learn about. So thank you for sharing that perspective.
Sure.
It's the same thing. Like I remember, early days of playing. It's like, I don't understand how you can play a guitar and sing at the same time. Those are two different processes. I got to tell you, most people who do it aren't thinking about it. They're just doing it, but that's not, to me or to, the guys in the group that I'm playing with, like, we don't think about that. We just kind of do it. Right. Or if you can't do it, you just practice it and you go note by note and put a metronome together. But who knows about that? And we would say the same thing. We would say, like, who cares about that? But those are the questions that come up all the time. Yeah.
I care about that because it's not natural to me, right? It's not something that I'm currently doing, and I find it fascinating.
Yeah. All right. So in a perfect world, what does the boy who brought the sea lead you to next?
So I would say in a perfect world, I'd love it to open up conversations, and I'd love for it to open up a space that allows me to travel more and talk with independently creative people more. So just the fact that this is happening, this discussion right now, I want this to open. I want it to be able to open doors to people and to show people that you can do this just because you have the idea and the grit to get through it. So I think for me, it creates more of that community. I think that's the ideal. I never saw this as a financial means to an end. I don't think it's ever going to be that, you talk about the starving artist community. But for me, it's more about empowering people and saying, and showing my kids, like, mom wrote a book, you can do whatever you want. I was not trained to write a book. I figured my way through it. And that's really what's at the heart of the TEDx talk that I gave as well is, every little experience you've had in your life has brought you to the point you're at right now. And they've all sort of pre-qualified you to do what you want to do. And so that's why you are there. I feel it's very sort of a, I don't want to say divine intervention or divine guidance, but there's a method to the madness, right?
Yeah. There's just a level of presence that happens with experience. Yeah. Amazing. In our actual world, what's up next for you?
In our actual world, from this perspective, I would say my next thing I want to do is publish a game for creative people that want to get into the writing space. And so we're actually working on a game through Loud Coffee Press called 8 Bells Bluff. You can see a preview of it on the Loud Coffee Press website at www.loudcoffeepress.com. But Eight Bells Bluff is a writer's game, and it takes you through the process of writing a story using a role-playing type of process. And I want my second book to come out. I'm hoping to finish my second full-length novel to be published in 2026. And I say second, this is going to be like the fifth book I've written, but the second one that I want to bring to the world. So
cool. That's awesome. I mean, I don't know how you do it all. I don't, and, you know,
ditto that.
right. We just do it, right? We just
do.
All right. And then you got to do the top 5 books, albums, movies of 24.
All right. So these did not all come from 2024, but I read or interacted in 2024. I wrote them down. The first one is I Am Homeless, If This Is Not My Home. That's a book by Lori Moore. This book blew me away. It's about a man that travels with a talking corpse, and I'll leave it at that. The next one is We Spread by Ian Reid, one of my prime influences. I thought that book was phenomenal. 2 movies I loved. One was Dinner in America, and the other was Strange Darling. Both of them have, this really subversive comedic sense to them. There's some darkness to, especially to Strange Darling. And I will add, I know this is more than 5 because I have 2 albums too, but The Oddity, I thought was a phenomenal horror that really actually scared me. And then album, I revisited a childhood love. I got into The Black Parade by My Chemical Romance all over again.
Record. Fantastic record, top down. Every song,
right? And then also I'm back into Rumors by Fleetwood Mac. My daughter's experiencing it, so now we're playing it on vinyl all the time, and it's been so much fun.
And that album is so analog, so warm and fuzzy, and the way, I don't know, I could talk about it for hours, and that's, I'm not here to talk about musicians, but Mick Fleetwood is the most underrated drummer of all time, because he can play boom, chick, and it's perfect. Perfect every single time. Kim, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Super excited about this book, super excited about your approach to the book, and the way you manage your creative world. I think is something that people should pay attention to. Excuse me. Loud Coffee Press is a brilliant idea, a brilliant place, a brilliant community for people to get together and experience the writing experience, which is kind of really what we talked about today, right? And I recommend that. And the only thing I'll say from here is, can you tell us where we can get the book? And if you want people to reach you if they have any questions.
Absolutely. So The Boy Who Brought the Sea is available through pretty much anywhere books are sold online. It's not in stores. That's a separate beast. But this is available through Amazon, through Barnes & Noble, through, a lot of Barnes & Noble affiliates. We also have copies that we put up on the Loud Coffee Press website you can option to have them signed or personalized. And that's again at loudcoffeepress.com. And you can find me on Instagram at Annie James Thomas.
Beautiful. Kim, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for taking some time out of your day, because clearly you're not busy at all ever. And you were nice enough to join us on this episode, and it's been a pleasure. And I can't wait to share your story with everybody.
Travis, thank you so much. This was so much fun. I appreciate it.